This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We are just back from COP23, the UN Climate Summit in Bonn, Germany, where the Trump administration tried to derail the conference by pushing coal, nuclear, and gas as solutions to climate change. Well, on this Democracy Now! Special, we're looking at the ways climate change is already affecting the United States. We turn now to Houston, which was devastated by massive flooding from Hurricane Harvey. The storm shattered all past U.S. rainfall records, forcing hundreds of thousands of people to evacuate their homes in the fourth largest city in the United States. Some call it the Petro Metro, Houston, because it's home to the country's largest refining and petrochemical complex. The storm also caused massive environmental and public health impacts. According to the Environmental Defense Fund, more than 1 million pounds of air pollution have been released into the air as petrochemical plants were forced to shut down by the storm. Well, over Labor Day weekend, just as the floodwaters were receding, Democracy Now! Traveled to Houston, where we spoke with Professor Robert Bullard, among others. Dr. Bullard is professor at Texas Southern University, a historically black college and university. He's considered the father of environmental justice. We spoke with Professor Bullard at his home, which he had just returned to after evacuating. I began by asking him about his experiences of the flood.
I had been monitoring the storm. I had been watching TV and getting very little sleep. And then we were informed that we had a mandatory evacuation. And I heeded that call, and I tried to move as much of my belongings from downstairs upstairs. And actually, I used muscles that I hadn't used before in that process. And so I evacuated on Tuesday, and was able to call a friend and was able to take my little bag over and stay until this morning. I came back this morning.
So, in fact, your home didn't flood?
No, we didn't flood. The water came up to on the streets, around surrounding streets, and some water came on the street, came up to the curb. But it did not flood. And it was, kind of a challenge getting out of the subdivision to get over to my friend's house. But I was able to maneuver and avoid the water and drive my car, in a way that I was not driving into water. But it was a challenge, but nothing like what other people have experienced.
You have written so much about and been so deeply involved in issues of environmental racism, environmental justice. Do you see the issue of environmental racism, and I'm going to ask you to define it first, playing out here in Houston around the storm?
Well, I think when we look at the color of vulnerability and we look at which communities are actually at greatest risk from disasters and floods like this, historically it's been low-income communities and communities of color, communities that live in low-lying areas that are very prone to flooding, and it's very difficult to get insurance, not just flood insurance, but regular insurance because of redlining. So what Harvey has done is to expose those inequalities that existed before the storm. And, as disasters like this widen and exacerbate inequality. And so the communities that are most at risk from not having, the kinds of infrastructure in those areas in terms of flood protection, in terms of trying to get out, in terms of transportation, et cetera. I mean, it played out, up close and personal. And I think as we start to see some of the demographics in terms of communities that will take longer to return, will take longer to get their houses back in order, longer to get their communities and infrastructure back in order. This is not rocket science. And those communities and individuals, households that don't have that cushion to ward off that kind of disruption, it's always much more difficult for them to return. And I don't see this any different in Houston, and what we have to do is guard against building and rebuilding on that inequity.
We just did a toxic tour of Houston. We were over in Baytown next to the ExxonMobil refinery. I think it's something like the second largest refinery in the country. Right by it, people flooded out. And you've got two many different aspects of this crisis, but one is the contract workers who work at ExxonMobil. They just lose their jobs when the refinery shuts down, and they also get flooded. And the question is, who will get help and who won't? But that issue, for example, while the Republican Texas congressional delegation largely voted against vast help for the Northeast during Superstorm Sandy, clearly Texas will get billions of dollars for FEMA and to rebuild overall. How is it determined who gets support and who doesn't?
Well, you know, the way it works is those individuals in those communities, those families and households that have the resources and the wherewithal to maneuver through this maze of bureaucracies of filing information online and getting access to the different organizations that can assist and support getting, you know, the FEMA grants and the SBA loans and all those things. It's not rocket science, but it's not easy to do that. And if you have individuals who are used to getting online and getting access to information and processing that, they have a head start. You know, there are lots of households right now that are actually hiring contractors that have already gutted their houses and that have already, you know, signed individuals on to fix up and remodel and bring their houses and back to life. And it's not any mystery as to which communities that will somehow be the last to do that. And these are the same communities that didn't have access to loans in terms of neighborhoods loans because of redlining. And what we have to guard against is this rebuilding redlining that somehow allows more affluent communities to access the system, get their communities back in order, and those who are left behind, somehow those areas will be the last to come back. So it has to be an equitable recovery, equitable development, and to make sure that those families that somehow may, you know, who's to say that one community should be built or rebuilt, not be rebuilt? And those are policy decisions, and if money is not invested in those areas, and if infrastructure is not invested in those areas, and many of the areas in many of the communities in Houston do not have the infrastructure to protect them from man-made disasters in terms of the flooding, the lack of infrastructure in terms of the protection. You know, a lot of our neighborhoods just have open drainage ditches, gullies, and just very minimum kinds of protection. And so it floods, you know, routinely. And so we're talking about this, you know, biblical flood. And so you can see how not only will they get washed out in terms of their homes, they'll get washed out in terms of their income.
This is the 30th anniversary of the publication of your book, Invisible Houston, The Black Experience in Boom and Bust. Talk about Invisible Houston.
In Invisible Houston that I wrote 30 years ago, there's a huge population that is still invisible. Houston's demographics, you know, a lot of people like to say we are one of the most diverse ethnically and racially cities in the country. We're the fourth largest city in the country. We are racially and ethnically diverse, but when it comes to economics and when it comes to power and decision-making, it stops. And so when we talk about this whole question of how invisible, how can we make invisible communities visible? Those communities that have been inundated before the storm by pollution, environmental degradation, living on the fence line with very dangerous kinds of facilities. And when a storm like this happens, it exposes those vulnerabilities. And you have all of this pollution, you know, all of this, you know, oil and chemical plants and that kind of pollution that's now exposed in the water, and when the flood's water recedes, it's going to leave residue. It's going to leave all kinds of stuff that on the school grounds, on the playgrounds, and on people's yards. And so how we're going to deal with those sediments that's left, and we need testing done. We have to make sure it is safe. all the mold. We learned from Katrina that people want to get back in their homes, and that in some cases they're rushing to get back without the proper protection. And with the mold in those homes and people getting sick, we have to make sure that we provide equal protection and equal access to resources to make sure that we do it right.
How do you do that?
Well, it means that we have to have strong community-based organizations on the ground with the capacity to assist and support families and households that can get things right, that can pressure and apply the points of saying, well, we need to make sure that just because you don't have a car, just because you don't have, a big bank account, doesn't mean that you should not be safe, that your community should not come back, and that you should not have the same level of protection, the same level of importance as if you were a middle-class white neighborhood. That's what we have to ensure. Houston is very segregated along racial and economic lines, and this flood has really shown that. If you look at zip code, you can map where that vulnerability is. You can also map how resources have been allocated and distributed over the last 50 years. And so what we have to do is we have to map the resources that come to this region, come to this area, and we can show and we can actually fight for to make sure that the resources that flow do not somehow flow in a way that somehow leaves those invisible communities. And in this case, I wrote Invisible Houston in '87. Invisible Houston, right, when I wrote it then, was Black Houston. But we're talking about a very diverse Houston today, and the Latino population is almost 50%. So when you talk about the invisibility and you talk about where the population lives, you talk about not only a disaster in terms of the flooding, you talk about a disaster in terms of the environment, the pollution, the health threats, the potential for the kinds of impacts that we will see, years to come. And the most vulnerable in our society is children, and we have to make sure that we protect our children, our vulnerable population.
That's Professor Robert Bullard, professor at Texas Southern University, author of, among other books, Invisible Houston. It's the 50th anniversary of that publication. He's considered the father of the environmental justice movement. To see all of our coverage of the hurricanes that hit Texas, Puerto Rico, Florida, the Caribbean, the wildfires of Northern California, as well as our week special from Bonn, Germany, the UN Climate Summit, go to democracynow.org. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Renee Feltz, Trina Nadura, Amel Ahmed, Nat Needham, Dennis Moynihan, Nicole Salazar, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Paul Huckabee, engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.